Are you well? It is now a month since that day. The happy dream is over. Tomorrow I will dive my plane into an enemy ship. Those are the opening lines of a letter written in the spring of 1945 by Flight Lieutenant Haruo Araki to his wife of exactly 1 month, the night before he flew his aircraft into an American ship off Okinawa. He was not screaming behind a set of goggles when he wrote it. He was sitting somewhere quiet, hands shaking badly enough that the unevenness of his own handwriting survives in the letter itself, apologizing to a woman he had barely finished marrying for having been, in his own words, too cold-hearted toward her, asking her to take care of his father, and asking her to live a long and happy life without him. He handed both that letter and a second one, addressed to his own father, to a visiting journalist the next morning, trusting a stranger to carry his final words home because there was no other way left to reach either of them in time. Nearly 4,000 young Japanese men volunteered for missions like his in the final year of the Second World War. This is the real story of who they actually were, what they actually wrote to the people they loved the night before they died. And the harder question underneath all of it, how many of them were really volunteers at all? If you want the real, documented history of the war in the Pacific, including the humanity that gets flattened out of the popular image of a kamikaze pilot, this channel exists to tell it straight. Stay with this one, because the story here is considerably more complicated and more human than the screaming caricature most people carry around in their heads. The Kamikaze program began, formally, in a single meeting on the 19th of October 1944, at Mabalacat Airfield near Manila, in the Philippines, at a moment when Japan's naval air power had been reduced almost to nothing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea that June, a defeat American aviators nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for how lopsided the aerial combat had become, had cost Japan the overwhelming majority of its carrier aircraft and a third of its remaining carriers, a battle in which inexperienced Japanese pilots, rushed through abbreviated training to replace years of accumulated combat losses, had been shot down in numbers so disproportionate to American losses that the Imperial Navy's carrier air arm effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force in a single afternoon. That collapse mattered enormously to what came next, because it meant the pool of pilots available to Onishi that October was already composed disproportionately of exactly the kind of hastily trained, minimally experienced young men least equipped to survive conventional aerial combat against increasingly skilled American pilots flying increasingly superior aircraft. A pool for whom a tactic that traded flying skill for a single-minded, unwavering final approach may have looked, from the cold vantage point of a desperate Japanese naval planner, like the only remaining way to extract meaningful military value from pilots who would very likely have died on their first conventional combat mission anyway. And by October, the entire 1st Air Fleet defending the Philippines against the advancing American invasion had only 41 operational aircraft left to work with, a mixed force of 0 fighters, a handful of torpedo bombers, and a single reconnaissance plane, so thin that conventional air combat against the American fleet approaching Leyte Gulf offered essentially no realistic chance of slowing the invasion down. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly arrived to take command of that skeleton force, was not a man improvising an idea in a vacuum. He had been quietly advocating what he called body-crashing tactics as early as July of that year, months before he ever formally organized a unit around the concept, and other Japanese officers had already conducted isolated, unofficial suicide attacks of their own initiative in the weeks before Onishi's meeting, including an Army squadron commander at Biak Island earlier that year, and a Naval Air Wing commander at Iwo Jima, who had shocked his own pilots that July by ordering them into suicide attacks without any formal doctrine yet in place to support the order. Onishi told his officers plainly that he saw no other way to disable an American carrier for even a week than to load a Zero fighter with a 500-pound bomb and fly it directly into the ship. Commander Asayachi Tamai gathered 23 of his own most talented student pilots, men he had personally trained, and asked for volunteers. Every one of them raised both hands. Tamai then asked Lieutenant Yukio Seki to command the unit, and by the accounts of men present in the room, Seki closed his eyes, lowered his head, sat in silence for roughly 10 seconds, and said simply that he would accept the post. He became, in the formal accounting that followed, the first kamikaze pilot in a program that would eventually claim close to 4,000 volunteers before the war's end. Onishi named the new unit the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Unit, a name that could also be read using an alternate pronunciation of the same characters as kamikaze, the word that would eventually become the only one most of the outside world ever learned. The reference reached back nearly 7 centuries, to a pair of typhoons in the 13th century that had scattered Mongol invasion fleets, threatening Japan under Kublai Khan. Storms Japanese tradition had long credited to divine intervention, protecting the home islands from conquest. Onishi and the officers around him deliberately reached for that specific historical memory, framing a fundamentally new and desperate tactic as a continuation of a centuries-old pattern of divine protection, rather than what it actually was. An improvised, last-resort response to a military situation that conventional tactics had already failed to solve. On the 25th of October, Seki led 5 aircraft off the runway at Mabalacat, and 4 of the 5 successfully struck their targets, sinking the American escort carrier St. Lo and damaging 6 other vessels, at the cost of a single pilot's life for each hit. It was, from a purely military accounting standpoint, a devastatingly efficient trade, and it validated Onishi's entire theory almost immediately. Within days, what had started as a single desperate unit assembled to buy a few weeks of time in the Philippines had become official Japanese naval doctrine, and by the time the fighting shifted to Okinawa the following spring, the program had grown into a central pillar of Japan's entire strategy for defending the home islands, with several thousand more sorties launched over the following 10 months, hitting hundreds of Allied ships and killing more than 7,000 American and British sailors before the war finally ended. Roughly 1 in 5 kamikaze aircraft that launched actually reached and struck a target, a success rate that would have been considered a catastrophic failure for almost any other kind of military mission, but that Japanese naval planners judged acceptable, specifically because the tactic traded a single expendable aircraft and pilot for the chance, however statistically unlikely on any given flight, of disabling or sinking a warship that would otherwise have taken a sustained, costly conventional attack by dozens of aircraft to achieve the same result. The American fleet off Okinawa endured the heaviest concentration of these attacks anywhere in the war, at times facing waves of dozens of aircraft in a single day. And experienced sailors who lived through it described as uniquely terrifying precisely because no amount of anti-aircraft fire could fully guarantee safety against a pilot who had already decided, before he ever took off, that his own survival was not a variable he needed conventional tactics to protect. Here is the distinction that tends to disappear from the popular memory of the kamikaze, and that historians who've studied the program closely treat as genuinely important rather than a minor technicality. The pilots who volunteered in that first meeting at Mabalacat in October of 1944 were, by every credible account of the moment, actual volunteers in the ordinary sense of the word. Men who raised their hands in a room where refusing was, at least formally, still a real option, and where the officer asking them to volunteer was a man they knew personally, who had trained them himself, and was not simply relaying an anonymous order from a headquarters none of them had ever seen. What followed after the Imperial Japanese military leadership formally adopted suicide attack as national strategy was something considerably murkier. One post-war naval analysis, written by an officer who had served in the theater, described the moment Imperial General Headquarters formally extended suicide tactics beyond the original Philippines defense into a doctrine covering the entire armed forces as something close to a national death sentence issued in the confusion of a leadership that had lost the wisdom of cool judgment after a long succession of defeats. An order that, once issued in the emperor's name, was according to that same analysis simply not open to question or criticism by the men who received it. Once the practice became official doctrine, backed by orders issued in the name of the emperor himself, refusing assignment to a special attack unit stopped being a real, exercisable choice for most of the young men who received it. Orders issued in the emperor's name were not, within the culture and command structure of the imperial military, treated as requests open to debate. A pilot could technically decline. Almost none did, because the social, institutional, and ideological pressure surrounding that decision made declining functionally equivalent to committing an unforgivable act of cowardice and disloyalty in front of every officer and fellow pilot he would ever have to face again. Officers overseeing later waves of recruitment for the special attack units frequently framed the question to assembled pilots as a call for volunteers, then made clear through tone, repetition, and social pressure that anything other than universal, immediate assent would be remembered. A dynamic that produced the appearance of unanimous enthusiasm, while leaving almost no room for any individual pilot to register private doubt without risking consequences that reached well beyond his own reputation. The men who actually flew these missions were, for the most part, extraordinarily young. Many were still in their late teens, barely out of secondary school. Some pulled directly from university classrooms under a wartime program that had suspended normal draft deferments for students, specifically to widen the pool of young men available for pilot training as Japan's manpower situation grew more desperate through 1944 and 1945. They were trained under an education system that had spent years steeping an entire generation in the belief that dying for the emperor represented the highest possible expression of a Japanese life. A doctrine one survivor of the era, Kinjo Shigeaki, later described bluntly, recalling that an entire generation had been raised believing 100 million Japanese citizens should be prepared to fight and die to the last person. A mindset that made light of ordinary life and gave death itself a kind of manufactured, exalted meaning that made refusal feel, to an 18 or 19-year-old raised inside that system, almost unthinkable regardless of what he privately felt. Textbooks, radio broadcasts, and daily classroom instruction throughout the pilot's formative years had reinforced the same message in slightly different language at every stage of their education, that individual survival mattered less than collective sacrifice, and that a death in service of the emperor carried a kind of spiritual weight no peacetime life could ever match. Indoctrination delivered consistently enough, over a long enough stretch of childhood and adolescence, that separating a pilot's genuine private belief from the belief the state had spent a decade constructing inside him becomes, for any historian examining these letters today, an almost impossible task. Flight training itself, compressed under wartime pressure into a fraction of the hours a peacetime Air Force would have considered adequate, left many of these young pilots with barely enough skill to get an aircraft off the ground and hold a straight course toward a target, let alone the kind of combat flying proficiency earlier generations of Japanese naval aviators had spent years developing, a detail that darkens the picture considerably once you consider it alongside the mission itself. A conventional fighter pilot needs years of training, specifically because keeping himself alive against a skilled, resisting enemy is difficult. A kamikaze pilot needed only enough training to reach a target and point his aircraft at it, which meant the military could, and did, push barely trained 18 and 19-year-olds through an abbreviated pipeline, specifically because survival was never actually part of the mission's design in the first place. A grim kind of efficiency that let Japan keep fielding pilots even as its supply of genuinely skilled aviators collapsed under years of attrition. Many of the pilots stationed at bases like Chiran on the southern island of Kyushu, one of the primary departure points for missions against the American fleet at Okinawa, spent their final night before a mission at a small inn called the Tomiya, run by a woman named Tome Torihama, who became, by the accounts of surviving pilots and their families, something close to a surrogate mother to hundreds of young men passing through in their final hours. Many of these pilots were stationed hundreds of miles from their actual families, with no realistic way to see their own parents or wives in the short window between receiving their assignment and flying their mission, which meant Torihama, and the inn she ran, filled a role the military's own command structure had no mechanism to provide, an ordinary domestic warmth in the last hours of otherwise extraordinarily young lives being spent almost entirely inside a rigid, impersonal military bureaucracy. Torihama fed them, listened to them, and in some documented cases, helped smuggle out final letters that bypassed military censors entirely, giving pilots one of their only chances to write something completely honest to the people they loved, rather than the more formal, ideologically approved language censors expected to see, correspondence official channels would otherwise have reviewed, and in some cases altered or withheld, before it ever reached a grieving family. Decades later, her family preserved much of that correspondence, along with photographs, some of which show young men in their late teens and early 20s, smiling, playing with a puppy kept at the inn, looking, in the hours before their deaths, like exactly what they were, ordinary teenagers rather than the fanatical caricature the West built around the word kamikaze, almost from the moment the attacks began. A small museum in the town of Chiran today, maintained in part by Torihama's own descendants, preserves both the inn story and a portion of the letters themselves. A short walk from the larger Chiran Peace Museum, where hundreds more photographs and final letters line the walls for visitors to read in full. The letters themselves, hundreds of which survive in Japanese museums and family collections today, read overwhelmingly like exactly what you'd expect from any young man saying goodbye to the people he loved, rather than the ideological screeds Western wartime propaganda often implied. Second Lieutenant Masashi Ohira, writing to his wife Fukuko before a mission off Okinawa in April of 1945, told her she had been too good a wife for him, and that she had been the only woman he had ever truly known. A letter written by a man who had, by every account, married Fukuko, knowing full well the assignment that likely awaited him. Choosing to build a marriage inside a window of time, both of them understood, might be measured in weeks rather than years. A decision that raises its own quiet, unanswerable question about what it means to marry someone you already suspect you will not live to grow old with, and what it says about both partners that they chose to do it anyway, rather than wait for a peace that neither of them could be certain would ever come in time. Second Lieutenant Toshio Kuramoto wrote to a woman named Kimiko, asking her forgiveness for the timing of his departure, explaining that it was only because he loved her that leaving caused him this much pain. A short, direct letter stripped almost entirely of the ideological language that fills so many of the other surviving letters, closer in tone to an ordinary goodbye note than a wartime proclamation. Ensign Ichizo Hayashi wrote a series of letters to his mother in the days before his own mission. Letters preserved today at the Kanoya Air Base Museum, filled less with declarations of ideological purpose than with ordinary, aching concern for how she would manage without him, repeatedly circling back to small, practical worries about her health and daily life, rather than any grand statement about the war itself. Ensign Masahisa Uemura wrote to his infant daughter, a child too young to ever remember the father writing to her, a letter that museum visitors today, by multiple accounts, frequently find themselves unable to read through without weeping, regardless of what side of the war their own families happen to have fought on. A document addressed to a reader who, by definition, could not yet understand a single word of it and would only ever come to know her father through the paper he left behind. None of this erases what these letters were actually building toward, and it would be dishonest to soften the fact that many of them, alongside the personal and the tender, also contained the language of duty and sacrifice that the ideology surrounding them had trained an entire generation to reach for as the only acceptable frame for what was happening to them. On the receiving end of these missions, the experience looked entirely different, and it's worth pausing on what that actually meant for the men aboard the ships these pilots were flying toward. American and British sailors serving off Okinawa in the spring of 1945 faced a form of attack conventional naval doctrine had never fully prepared them for. One where the normal calculus of anti-aircraft defense, damaging an incoming aircraft enough to force it to break off, simply didn't apply in the same way, since a badly damaged Kamikaze aircraft could still complete its mission as long as the pilot retained enough control to point it at a target before the airframe came apart entirely. Destroyers assigned to radar picket duty, stationed on the outer perimeter of the fleet specifically to provide early warning of incoming raids, absorbed a disproportionate share of these attacks and suffered accordingly. And sailors who served on picket duty during the Okinawa campaign frequently described the psychological toll of the assignment. Watching an aircraft that both sides understood was never going to turn back, as considerably heavier than the toll of more conventional combat, where an enemy pilot retained at least some rational incentive to preserve his own life and aircraft. That asymmetry, one side fighting to survive and the other side deliberately fighting without survival as a goal at all, is part of what made the Kamikaze campaign land so hard on the American psyche at the time, and part of why the wartime caricature of the fanatic proved so durable for so long afterward. Araki's letter to his wife, for all its tenderness, closes not with simple grief, but with a statement that he had lived for what he called the eternal principles of justice and would forever protect the nation from its enemies. Language lifted almost directly from the ideological training every one of these young men had been immersed in for years before they ever climbed into a cockpit for the last time. The tenderness and the ideology were not competing forces pulling in opposite directions inside these letters. They existed together, in the same paragraphs, in the same young men, because that was genuinely how thoroughly the training and propaganda of the period had fused personal love and national sacrifice into a single, inseparable emotional register for the people writing them. By 1945, the program had also produced something even more extreme than a conventional aircraft flown into a target. The Oka, a small, rocket-powered, purpose-built flying bomb with barely enough room for a single pilot and no landing gear at all, was designed from its very first blueprint with no path home built into it whatsoever, carried partway to its target slung beneath a larger bomber before being released to make its own final, unpowered or rocket-assisted dive into an Allied ship. American sailors who encountered it gave it a nickname of their own, Baka, the Japanese word for fool, a rare instance of the men on the receiving end of these attacks coining a term almost as dismissive as anything Western propaganda ever produced about the broader Kamikaze program. where a conventional kamikaze mission at least technically permitted a pilot to abort and return to base if he failed to locate a target, the Oka offered no such option by design, a weapon built specifically around the assumption that the man inside it would not be coming back under any circumstances, the clearest possible physical expression of how far the entire program had moved from Seki's 10 seconds of genuine, freely chosen silence in that first meeting in October of 1944. The bomber crews tasked with carrying the Oka partway to its target faced their own extraordinary danger in the process, flying slower and less maneuverably than usual under the added weight and drag of the weapon slung beneath them, meaning American fighter pilots learned to target the mother aircraft itself well before it ever reached release range, turning many Oka missions into a double loss, bomber crew and Oka pilot both, without the weapon ever coming close to an actual target. Here's the thing worth sitting with, because the honest picture of who these pilots actually were sits uncomfortably between two competing, equally incomplete stories that both got told about them at different points over the following decades. American wartime propaganda, understandably shaped by men who were watching these attacks kill their fellow sailors in real time, largely painted kamikaze pilots as fanatical, almost inhuman zealots, a framing that made the tactic easier to process psychologically, easier to fight against without hesitation, and easier to explain to a home front that had no context for a military tactic built entirely around the certainty of a pilot's own death, but a framing that the letters themselves, once they became available to Western readers decades later, made considerably harder to sustain without qualification. The opposite oversimplification, that every one of these pilots was simply a coerced, tragic victim with no genuine belief in what he was doing, doesn't hold up especially well against Yukio Seki's 10 seconds of silence either. A moment historians studying the program have generally read as a man making an actual, if agonized, choice rather than simply following an order he had no real power to refuse, or against the 23 pilots at Mabalacat who raised both hands without any officer standing over them demanding they do so. The truth sits in the genuinely uncomfortable middle these two clean stories both avoid. Some of these young men, particularly in the earliest cohort at Mabalacat, made something that resembles a real choice, shaped enormously by the ideology they'd been raised inside, but not entirely absent of individual agency. Men who understood the alternative, a Japan overrun by an invading army, as a fate they judged worse than their own individual deaths. A much larger number who followed them into the program over the final year of the war operated under conditions where refusal, while technically not illegal, carried a social and institutional cost that made it nearly unthinkable. A distinction between a volunteer and a man following an order dressed up as a request that mattered enormously to the people living through it, and that gets flattened every time the word kamikaze gets used as a simple synonym for religious fanaticism. Historians who've spent careers on this specific question have generally landed somewhere close to that same uncomfortable middle, rejecting both the wartime American caricature of mindless fanaticism and the post-war Japanese tendency, in some corners, to romanticize the pilots as purely noble, willing self-sacrifice, in favor of a messier truth that involves real belief, real coercion, real love for family, and real fear, often coexisting inside the same 18-year-old in the same 24 hours before he climbed into a cockpit for the last time. That messiness is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses to resolve into a story with a clean moral. And it's worth naming directly why that discomfort matters. A story about pure fanatics asks nothing of the audience beyond horror and distance. A story about pure coerced victims asks for sympathy, but still keeps the pilots at arm's length. Objects of pity, rather than people making choices, however constrained, inside a system they didn't build and mostly didn't ask to be part of. The letters themselves refuse both of those comfortable distances. They put a specific, named, 20-year-old man in the room with you, worried about his wife's future, apologizing to a father who never looked up from his fieldwork long enough to hear the apology in person, writing to a daughter who would grow up entirely without him. And they ask you to hold all of that at the same time as the fact that the next morning, that same young man climbed into an aircraft with the specific, deliberate intention of ending his own life alongside as many of the people aboard an American or British ship as the impact could kill. Both of those things are true about the same person, in the same letter, often in the same paragraph, and the discomfort of holding them together is very likely the most honest response available to anyone actually reading what they wrote. Japan's own relationship with how to remember these young men remains genuinely unresolved even today, 8 decades later. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, which honors Japan's war dead, including kamikaze pilots, alongside a number of convicted war criminals from the broader conflict, remains one of the most politically charged sites in the entire country, visited periodically by government officials in ways that reliably reignite diplomatic tension with China and South Korea, both of which view any official reverence shown toward Japan's wartime military as an implicit whitewashing of a broader war of aggression across the region that cost millions of lives well beyond Japan's own borders. Every visit by a sitting Japanese prime minister or senior cabinet official to the shrine generates predictable diplomatic protests from Beijing and Seoul within hours, a ritual of outrage and defense that has repeated itself, with only minor variation, for decades, illustrating how completely the memory of pilots like Seki, Araki, and Ohira remains entangled with a much larger, unresolved regional argument about Japanese wartime responsibility, that these individual young men, whatever they actually believed the night before their missions, never had any real power to settle on their own. The museums at Chiran and Kanoya, by contrast, have generally worked to present the pilots primarily through the lens of personal tragedy, young lives cut short by a war and an ideology neither museum makes much effort to defend, an institutional choice that has allowed the letters themselves to reach a global audience, largely stripped of the nationalist framing that surrounded them when they were first written. Visitors to these museums today, including a growing number of Japanese school groups brought specifically to encounter the letters as part of post-war peace education, frequently describe leaving with a more complicated, more human impression than whatever image of the kamikaze they arrived with. An outcome that suggests the letters themselves, freed from the propaganda that originally surrounded their creation, may do more honest work in the present day than either the wartime hero narrative or the wartime enemy caricature ever managed to do at the time. Critics on both sides of that debate continue to argue about whether either framing, hero or victim, does full justice to what actually happened to these specific, named, ordinary young men, a debate that shows no real sign of resolving itself as the last living witnesses to the period, on every side of the war, continue to grow fewer with each passing year. English language scholarship on the Kamikaze program has itself shifted noticeably over the decades since the letters first became widely available, moving away from the flat wartime caricature toward exactly the kind of complicated, uncomfortable middle ground this episode has tried to sit in. Work by historians who've spent years cross-referencing surviving letters against military records, unit rosters, and interviews with the small number of pilots who were assigned to missions but survived the war anyway, either because their aircraft malfunctioned before reaching a target, because the war ended before their scheduled mission date arrived, or because they were among the roughly 4 in 5 who launched and simply failed to find or strike anything before running out of fuel. Those survivors occupy a strange, largely undocumented corner of this history themselves. Men who had already written their own final letters, said their own goodbyes, and made whatever peace they'd made with the mission, only to find themselves alive afterward, with no clear script for how to return to an ordinary life they had spent their final weeks deliberately preparing to leave behind for good. Onishi himself did not survive to see how history would eventually judge the program he built. On the 15th of August 1945, the day Japan's surrender was announced, Onishi took his own life by ritual suicide, leaving behind a final message apologizing to the roughly 4,000 pilots he had sent to their deaths and expressing hope that the young people of Japan would find in their sacrifice a reason to work toward peace. A note that reads, depending entirely on how much good faith a reader is willing to extend to the man who built the entire program, either as a genuine final reckoning with what he had done, or as one more piece of the same ideological language that had sent so many of his own men to their deaths in the first place, asking a nation's youth to find meaning in a sacrifice he himself had specifically designed to require no survivors at all. If you want more of the real, documented history of the Pacific War, including the human stories that get lost inside the larger strategic narrative, subscribe, and tell me in the comments whether you think Seki and the men who followed him were making a real choice, or simply the only choice a system like that one ever really allowed them to make.